We are here to entertain and inform you, I think I heard one of you say, about the path to energy superabundance. What is energy superabundance? Well, if you want a definition, we could call it, say, 10xing per capita energy usage, maybe 10xing that of the US and also bringing the rest of the world up to the same standard at, costs of, say, 1 cent per kilowatt hour or less, right? We're talking very cheap, very abundant energy, far beyond what we have today. You may know, in the U.S., per capita energy usage has flatlined since the 1970s. We use about 10 kilowatts per person, and that has been the same for the last 50 years. So we're talking about going up to 100 kilowatts, which would be a big increase from today. So what I want to do here, and I've been looking forward to this session for a long time, by the way. Like when we thought of this conference, this is one of the first things I thought I really wanted to do. So very glad that both you guys have agreed to do this. So Bret Kugelmass is the founder of Last Energy, a nuclear fission company. Casey Handmer is the founder of Terraform Industries, which uses solar energy to synthesize hydrocarbons, both dedicated to the future of energy superabundance. Our goal today is to walk away with a better informed and clearer vision of what does that future look like and how are we going to get there, and where is it going to come from, and what energy sources is it going to come from, and what will that overall sort of economy look like. I'm interested in both the technical and social factors behind this, so I would sort of like to understand, if society and public opinion and regulation were not any kind of issue or barrier, like what would the ideal sort of world look like, just purely based on physics and engineering? And then also maybe, if we have time, hopefully we can talk a little bit about how might the social context change that. So I invited these two folks because, first, they're both extremely intelligent, deeply researched, deeply technical, very well read, knowledgeable, both highly opinionated, which is going to make for fun discussion. Both all in on the future of energy superabundance. I assume if either of you change your mind, stand up and walk out now. But they are, they're currently committed to different technologies. And so I wanted to see if there are actually any differences of opinion. I suspect there are some, and to draw that out. Now, this is not a debate. This is not an argument. This is not Jerry Springer. I'm not going to get them to, go at each other's throats. We're not going to declare a winner. That's not what this is about. I'm hoping we'll have an interesting discussion and that we'll all walk out of here better informed, and we'll all walk out a winner. You're right next to me. So, Bret, why don't you start? I'd love to just hear, take the mic, and I'd love to just hear, what is your vision of the future of energy? Where's it going to come from and why?
Yeah, so, okay, this idea of superabundance, right? I guess you laid out the clear beginning of it. It's like, let's bring the entire world up to the standards of the US, and I would like it to be more whole food standards and less stop and shop standards. And then what we can do from there is the first thing I would probably start doing is filtering everything that comes into our body to be higher quality. So filter all of the air, filter all of the water, highest quality food, and then go to comfort, right? And just increase the comfort of everything that we do. More energy means that we don't need to care about things like aerodynamics as much when it comes to designing transport systems. Make your planes twice as big, your cars twice as big. It doesn't matter then. And so we can fundamentally change the way that we shape the world moving into the future if the energy part of the equation, and by the way, energy is part of the equation to absolutely everything. And if you start turning the dial by orders of magnitude on that part of the equation, it could be a very, very interesting and new way that we go about shaping the future of the world.
And so, technically, where is all this energy going to come from?
Well, obviously I'm a big proponent of nuclear. I think the fundamental physics advantage, right? I think everything comes down to the amount of mass to deliver a certain amount of energy. And nuclear has a 6 order of magnitude advantage on chemical-based systems, and still a 3 order of magnitude advantage on renewables. And so, there's a limitless amount of uranium available. You're talking, if you were to 10x the amount of energy that we produce, you'd still have something like 500 million years worth of uranium that is accessible at reasonable costs. And it only becomes cheaper to access it as energy becomes cheaper as well. So I'm all in on 1,000xing the amount of nuclear that we have.
So if we get to 100 kilowatts per person, do you see that as like, is that 100% from nuclear fission? Is that like, do you have some vision of like what the breakdown might be? Are we still going to be using fossil fuels? Where, is there a role for renewables? Like, what do you?
Well, I think this is somewhere that our visions probably overlap significantly, and that is chemical energy is still an incredible mechanism to transport energy around the world. And so much like Casey, I would suggest using hydrocarbons to deliver the energy that we need and to rapidly transform the way that we consume energy around the world without having to rapidly transform all of the existing infrastructure, right? Like that's the hack to get there faster. But I'll let you talk more to that because you focus more on that end.
Okay, cool. Casey, your vision.
I think it's in the context of this kind of 10x increase of energy consumption, it's important to note that compared to our pre-industrial ancestors, we've already 100x'd here in the United States our energy consumption. And that has brought us incredible improvements of quality of life, almost unimaginable in many ways. I'm just reading some Jules Verne to my kids right now, and it's like quite clear that like what we have done is well beyond their wildest dreams, even in the 1860s and 70s. So another 10x increase on top of that. Well, I don't personally anticipate like, having a house that's 10 times the size or like running my air conditioner at 10 times lower temperature or something like that. But in terms of things that you can spend that much energy intelligently on, it's, looking for really energy intense applications. So I'm thinking like, very, very much higher levels of per capita compute and much higher levels of like really energy intensive transportation. So like supersonic aircraft, flying to space, anything that like really burns through the gas. It gets you there. And then kind of in terms of this there's a couple other numbers I thought I'd throw out there. Right now, globally, we generate something like 10 or 15 terawatts of electricity. If what Terraform is doing kind of scales globally and we bring the rest of the world up to that level, we'll have something like 400 terawatts. So it's actually a significant increase on the current baseline energy generation, which is great for anyone who's in energy generation business because it means if you can hit, the kind of the cost and the utility thresholds, there's essentially unlimited space for growth. And then the last thing I would mention is that, to rough orders of magnitude, we have like $1 trillion of like energy generation infrastructure, $10 trillion of energy transportation infrastructure, and $100 trillion of energy utilization infrastructure. And it is, globally. And so to the extent that we're able to perform like upstream simple kind of, augmentation or swap out of existing energy generation infrastructure, it's like 10 or 100 times more capital efficient than saying, okay, well, what if we just switched everyone over to hypothetically nuclear-powered refrigerators or something like that, at the end point. Which is just to kind of echo your point there. As far as hydrocarbons go, I live and breathe them every day. I think the electrification is like a huge forcing function. So we'll see like continued electrification of heating and cooling and say ground transportation. I think that Tesla has like basically written the correct rule book on that. But at the same time, for like really energy intensive applications, hydrocarbons are unbeatable. And so for, principally supersonic aircraft. And just to kind of underscore that, right now, something like 2% of global hydrocarbons is spent on aviation. And that's just to fly like you, me, and about 10 million other people around the world fairly frequently. Most of the world's population flies in planes like once or twice in their lifetime, if at all. And just think of like, the reason I sound funny is because I was able to come from other countries to live here, and just think like what the world would look like if we're able to extend that privilege to 100 million people, to 1 billion people, to 10 billion people, because we're able to increase that consumption. But obviously, if you look at current hydrocarbon production, going from 2% to 20% to 200% to 2,000% is like beyond the scope of what we can find underground quite easily. So this kind of enormous opportunity for expansion of production that doesn't require like top-down governmental like do it this way, do it that way. It's like naturally kind of just as an economic forcing function for it if we can increase supply and make money while we're doing it.
Okay, so if we get to 100 kilowatts, is it all going to come from solar?
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay, why?
Well, so kind of, I mentioned before, we got to go from like 15 terawatts to 400 terawatts, which is roughly a 25x increase. And if you look at the current kind of leaderboard in terms of like which energy formats or which energy sources are growing most quickly, it is solar by far. If you say, well, globally we've got like 450 to 500 gigawatts of nuclear. If we just like double that to 1 terawatt, well, great, but that's like less than 1%. So like I should say I'm not anti-nuclear. I'm actually somewhat reluctantly pro solar. I taught nuclear physics at Caltech. Like I'm not like I agree that like the regulatory issues are a problem, and I think the safety issues are largely overblown. But even taking that into account, it is like solar is increasing deployment by like 50 to 60% per year, and everything else is pretty much flatline in comparison to that. So, and this is a race that will be won in the next 20 years. So it is the case that if other energy sources, whatever they are, want to play a major role and like deploy 1 or 10 terawatts of power over the next 20 years, they have to get their ass in gear like really soon, because it'll be all over by the shouting, within the next few years.
That's funny. I didn't realize that you'd studied nuclear physics, and something most people don't know about me is that my first job was designing solar panels at NanoSolar. That's awesome.
Guys, this is turning into a love fest. Come on.
Yeah, so listen, I mean, you're right. If you look at the current leaderboard, if you're looking at the current trends, I mean, I just don't think that there's anything that means that those trends are going to continue. I think there's a lot of things that crop up as you get to different orders of magnitude at scale. And I'm doing mine, my assumptions on like a first principles basis, and then also tackling there are a lot of problems with nuclear and how it's deployed today. And to me, it just seems like, all right, well, if on a first principles basis it wins, just identify the correct problems to solve, not necessarily technology problems, but deployment problems, supply chain problems, perception problems, regulatory problems. As long as you're tackling the correct problems, that's how we're going to unlock the power source that has this 3 order of magnitude advantage over renewables.
So, so Noah Smith, actually, is Noah here? Oh, and. So he wrote a piece recently saying basically just like, guys, let it go. Like the nuclear retrofuture, it was a beautiful dream. Maybe it should have happened. It's too late now. Why bother? We've got solar. Solar's a better technology. It's just happening. Why do you still have your heart set on nuclear? Why should we not give up on this? Why should we not just let the nuclear retrofuture go?
Just let it go. I mean, like that's the antithesis of entrepreneurship. I mean, all we do is like hold on to something like a dog and not let it go until we change the world. Listen, I think solar has a lot of fundamental problems that don't work about it, except for your vision. I mean, like if you were to utilize the solar to create hydrocarbons, I think that makes sense. So I think your vision makes sense. But the way that the society is constructed to deploy solar right now, it actually doesn't make sense. You see the places with the highest level of solar penetration having the highest systems costs. Okay, maybe the prices of solar panels can go down, but the systems levels cost goes up. So I think we're going to have a real struggle as society with the continued expansion of solar power. One example is, I mean, you guys have probably seen all the news about nuclear plus tech companies equals data center plus AI. It's like, okay, all right. So that's what we're seeing a lot of. And I've been seeing that in my business too. And when these data center companies come to us, they tell us the benchmark that we have to beat for clean energy being sold into data centers is $250 per megawatt hour. If they were to build their own solar farm plus battery on a site near their data center, $250 a megawatt hour.
That's expensive.
Yeah.
That is not the price you pay for energy.
And meanwhile, 1960s nuclear power was $20 a megawatt hour, and we only went up from there. So what I propose is that we only go down from there instead of up from there. That's how economies of scale should work. So let's fix the supply chain problems to ride the same experience curve that every other technology, including solar, has gotten to ride, except starting where they all asymptote and then only going down further from there.
Do you want to add to that, Casey?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great summary. I think in the context of AI data centers, it's important to remember that this is one potentially like extremely high growth future demand sink, or source of demand, I should say, for power, but also one that's relatively price insensitive. So when you run the math on building a new data center, if you have solar plus batteries, it's like less than 5% of the overall cost to power it. If you throw in nuclear, it's also kind of quasi-affordable. And that is not the same as for you and me. People are extremely price sensitive when it comes to power. and the economic benefits of power is also extremely price sensitive. The thing that Bret just referred to, and one of the reasons why what Terraform is doing is kind of adapted to solar, is that there's enormous economic opportunity for new processes that are intermittency friendly, which is kind of a capital requirement, a technology requirement. And if you can build something that does that, then you can kind of run all the way to the bank, which is what we're in the process of doing. The batteries allow you to kind of switch that from 6 hours a day to 24 hours a day or something like that. But batteries like solar have this incredibly important property, which is that they're already like produced in dozens and dozens of monster factories at enormous scale, and the prices are coming down extremely quickly. And this kind of speaks to a subtlety that I think is widely underappreciated, which is that when we think of manufacturing, normally we think as energy as an input, right? The energy is an input, and then over time we get iPhones cheaper, and we get shoes cheaper, and we get clothes cheaper, and so on, or cars for that matter. In the context of solar and batteries, energy is the output. We have figured out how to manufacture energy, and because we figured out how to manufacture energy, we figured out how to get all the benefits of manufacturing, including like ongoing cost improvements, into that kind of supply chain. And this is not like some hypothetical kind of theoretical thing that like, oh, if you build a factory for this, we'll be able to decost like crazy. It has already happened. It's been going on for 20, 30, 40 years, and it's reached the point now where it's kind of at the main tier. And when you speak to SMR companies and so on, their model for how they'll achieve the kind of cost savings they need to get back to sort of 1960s level costs and then improve is that they want to build like multiple giant monster factories to like churn these out, to like have that same kind of manufacturing cost improvement property that solar and batteries already enjoy. So I completely support that. Don't get me wrong. Like if you're sufficiently hell bent on building SMRs and getting the cost down that low, great. And I'll say this right now as someone who is a major consumer of energy in my business. If you can produce power at $10 a megawatt hour, which is 25 times cheaper than these things, then I will sign on the dotted line. I will consume like unlimited quantities of it as fast as you can produce it, no questions asked. It makes our life a lot easier if that's possible. But it's also an externality I can't control, and I want to remove from the critical path for what we're doing. So.
Yeah, Bret, so on that topic of scale, right, so why is it that people talk about this all the time, right? Oh, nuclear hasn't managed to get economies of scale. It hasn't gone down the learning curve. In fact, famously, learning curves were negative and maybe still are negative. That is, nuclear gets more expensive to build over time, whereas most things in the world get cheaper to build over time as we get better at them. Everybody hopes that SMRs small modular reactors, will be the thing that lets us build nuclear in factories and apply all of our, 20th century factory making things cheaper knowledge to them. Why hasn't it happened yet? Why does this seem to be so difficult? Can it happen?
When I first set out to tackle this problem about 7 years ago, I took my time. I did 2 years of just interviewing experts in the sector. That first year alone, I conducted 865 subject matter expert interviews across policy, technology, industry, regulations. I went to 15 different countries to see how they did nuclear. And I came up with a very heterodox perspective that the entire industry was trying to solve the wrong problems. And the way the industry had been constructed over the last several decades was that they benefited much more from these rent-seeking, self-cannibalization efforts where they just use regulatory capture to keep making the regulations more difficult for them to build new nuclear, but much more profitable to offer nuclear engineering services into existing facilities. And so that is the path that the industry has taken, and it's also informed the culture of new nuclear entrepreneurs as well. The PhD students, the professors that are coming up with all these wonderful new reactor technologies, they've actually chosen a pathway that is going to continue to make it more expensive too by deviating from the standard supply chain. And so that became our fundamental core, here's how we're going to do this. No new nuclear technology, just a new systems integration effort to make it mass manufacturable.
So basically you said to the industry, have you tried solving the problem?
Yeah.
Exactly. Have you tried trying? Yeah.
Just to express some sympathy here, that trend continues, right? Like the rent-seeking of the nuclear industry in Europe has got to the point where it was much more profitable to provide kind of like safety upgrade services to existing reactors than to build new reactors, and to encourage. And today, it's even more profitable to demolish reactors than to continue to upgrade them, because in the demolition process, first of all, there's no deliverable other than empty land eventually, and secondly, you get halfway through and you're like, oh, look at that. Change order 18 because I said so. Just infinite money for basically nothing. It's insane. Similar things are occurring in solar as well, actually, which is unfortunate. But fortunately, with solar, you don't have to be Bechtel or whatever to kind of enter the market. So there's much less friction on new players coming in and disrupting existing kind of oligopolies that are trying to capture sections of this.
And so why is this, right? So critics of nuclear will look at this and say, look, it's too expensive to keep the plants running. We just can't afford to do it. Oh, it's too expensive to build new plants. It's better to just shut them down, right? I mean, they'll point to the economics of it as evidence that there's something fundamentally wrong with this technology and it shouldn't exist. Like, why does the economics run this way?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the criticism is correct. It's just what do you do from there that's incorrect. So, okay, you've found problems with the industry. Great, let's go solve it. Let's not abandon, let's not cast out the core technology wholesale.
But the reason why it's costing too much to keep a plant running, is it the technology? Is it something about the regulation? Is it like, what are the fundamental economics of this that are broken?
Yeah. Okay. So for instance, after September 11th, the nuclear industry itself lobbied to write a rule that you have to have 100 security guards per plant. You have to have 100 security guards per plant, no matter the size, right? That's a form of rent-seeking behavior for like the nuclear defense, security part of the industry. But they go so much further than that. I don't think people realize how much they are ratcheting up the rules year over year over year. It's not just that you have to have 100 security guards. They then write in rules that say these security guards need special certifications. They actually write a rule that the security guards, what level of exercise they need to perform in terms of like how many minutes their heart rate needs to get up per week. Okay, it's very difficult. So that drives up the cost of these security guards. It drives up the cost of compliance, and everyone who's making, and it makes a lot of people a lot of money, except it's a tax for the people who consume the energy.
So how are you and Last Energy getting around this?
Yeah, so when we identified that the root cause of the problem was the behavior from the nuclear incumbents, and then the proximate cause was the using the regulator, and we went regulator shopping. That was our strategy. So I'd gone around the world interviewing all these subject matter experts. That included regulators from around the world too. I found 4 different regulators that had a different regulatory framework. Instead of it being prescriptive, it was performance-based. So they set these goals, and you just have to show them how you meet the goals. One of those countries is the United Kingdom, and so we've decided to focus a lot of our efforts there and a few other countries as well.
So let's go back to this thing about density, right? So nuclear fuel, incredibly energy dense, right? Solar is much less dense, particularly for land area. So Casey, why is this why is this not a problem, or why is this not getting in the way of a brilliant solar superabundant future?
I mean, technically, apples to apples, the solar fuel is in the sun, and so it's dividing by 0. So it's even better than nuclear. And
I don't think that's exactly the relevant comparison.
The reason that
Also, as a physicist, you shouldn't be dividing by 0.
as a physicist, I will do whatever I want. It's certainly true that like nuclear fuel has insane energy density. It's also true that despite best efforts, the nuclear fuel cost is not the dominant cost of nuclear, right? It turns out that the cement is much more expensive than the fuel. In the case of solar, I think the correct way to think about this is that, as a species, we are in the business of transforming sections of the surface of the Earth into energy gathering stuff upstream of our consumption. And so it makes more sense to compare solar to agriculture than it does to compare it to, naval reactor in a submarine or something like that. And so you can ask yourself the question, if I have a bunch of land that is already like prime farming land that produces a couple of $100 per acre per crop, and I instead put solar on that land, what is my revenue per acre per year or something? And it's like on the order of 100 times higher, which is kind of startling, but it's also, it rhymes nicely with we consume 100 times more energy in the form of like electricity and oil and gas than we do in the form of food. And if you say, well, if I have a bunch of land that I can't irrigate and I don't have any pesticides or fertilizers, and that land is absurdly hot, it's too hot to grow plants on or whatever, and I put solar on there, obviously that does similarly miraculous things for the economic productivity of that land. And so if you ask the question like, okay, we want to make all our oil and gas using synthetics with solar, plus all the existing electricity production with solar, how much land do we end up using? Something like 2% of Earth's land surface area, which sounds like a large number. It is, in terms of acres, it's a very large number. Compared to global agriculture, that's like 20 to 30%, depending on the continent. Forestry is like another 10 or 20%. Just urbanization, like stuff we've covered in concrete and asphalt and so on is about 1 or 2% depending on where you are. So it's kind of comparable to that. Just as an example, Singapore is an extremely densely populated island with kind of so-so solar resources because of cloud cover. But if you put rooftop solar on every structure in Singapore, you can meet its domestic energy demand without any additional solar deployment outside of those existing structures, which I think is kind of a fascinating example there. So I think that it's kind of the wrong question to ask. I do think that land cost is ultimately not part of the equation when you talk about 40% learning rate for solar modules or something like that, and that will ultimately form something like a cost floor for the price of power you can get from solar, kind of marginally in the future, especially given that you can greatly improve the value of land through solar powered processes. But yeah, I'm not too worried about it. I don't know if that answers the question or if I just sidestepped it.
I think so. What do you think, Bret? Do you feel like that?
Yep. A lot of nuclear advocates will critique solar's land consumption, but I similarly agree. I think it's a non-issue.
And what about the intermittency point? So you're obviously dealing with intermittency by synthesizing hydrocarbons, which you can do intermittently. Nobody cares what time of day the hydrocarbons were synthesized. But I don't know. I mean, should we be using nuclear for our baseload power because it's 24/7? What do you guys think?
I mean, I think that's a common selling point for nuclear. If you're able to adapt an industrial process to consume intermittent power, which, as I said, is a technical requirement, and also you have to get your capex down below about $200 per kilowatt, which is extremely expensive KitchenAid level territory, then obviously there's a huge business to be done there. And I encourage all of you to take a break from writing Substack and incorporate hardware startups and destroy your lives in the same way that we have. But seriously, at the end of the day, you should work on hardware because one day you're going to die. But as far as dealing with intermittency goes, essentially batteries exist to arbitrage that thing. So when we think about power, we never have electricity where we want it, right? There's always either a spatial or a temporal arbitrage, right? If we're trying to toast stuff this morning, well, the power from that is coming from a power plant 50 miles down the road. We perform the spatial arbitrage with power lines, and we perform the temporal arbitrage with pumped hydro or batteries or whatever. And as I said before, batteries are also on this kind of crazy learning curve. So if you're saying, well, nuclear might have a role in the future to perform this kind of baseload power, bearing in mind, of course, that civilian nuclear reactors generally struggle to kind of ramp their power on diurnal timescales that humans consume or vary their power usage due to xenon poisoning, that in order to compete with a combination of solar and batteries, not only do you have to stop getting more expensive, you have to start getting cheaper faster than solar and batteries are getting cheaper, which is really hard to do because solar and batteries are crazy easy to produce compared to a nuclear power plant. Even if you don't have the NRC breathing down your neck, it's just, you don't need any vanadium, right? Just right off the top, no vanadium. So you I think the model there is pretty clear that maybe when I was a young man or a kid, the per capita allocation of lithium-ion batteries is maybe a few tens of grams per person. And by the time my kids are graduating college, it'll probably be a few hundred kilograms per person. So our wealth expressed in lithium-ion batteries will be up by 4 orders of magnitude. And that will just give us the ability to store and use this power, during the day, during the night, whenever we need it, for rail guns, et cetera, et cetera. Very, very important applications.
So my very high-level understanding is that many industrial processes are optimized to run 24/7,
yeah,
and to retool them to run intermittently is non-trivial. Is it? I mean, is it?
What's your moat? That's my moat.
On the range from trivial to impossible.
Okay.
Can we change all of our industrial processes to run intermittently, or is this a significant technical challenge?
Well, I think if you're an investor or an entrepreneur kind of asking yourself, how do I end up owning a huge piece of some fundamental infrastructure pie? This is your opportunity, right? But if you say, well, our steel industry is already fully amortized and all I care about is just running it cheaply. Well, it mostly consumes hydrocarbons anyway, and hydrocarbons are very storable. So we produce hydrocarbons during the day. The hydrocarbon, distribution system has weeks to months of storage. That's not really a problem.
We can put all the intermittency in one place.
Nothing changes.
And then buffer it via natural gas.
For electricity consumption, I think the canonical case is well, I've just spent, billions of dollars on the latest OpenAI, AI training center. The cost of an H100 is about $50,000 per kilowatt, which is God tier level, KitchenAid. And so I obviously want to get 99.9+% utilization out of that asset. And so I'm going to have to put batteries in. But if you look at the economics and you say, well, I'll put in 5 hours of batteries, I'll put 24 hours of batteries, I'll put in 48 hours of batteries, I'll put in 168 hours of batteries, it barely changes the economics at all. It's just hey, Tesla Megapack, I need to buy enough batteries, you're going to have a great quarter. it doesn't actually change the economics in that case. There's just a handful of cases that are kind of on the margin between like, it might be cheaper to run it 24 hours a day, or it might be cheaper to run it 6 hours a day. But like that's a rounding error in the scale of the global economy. I'm not too worried about it.
Yeah, so this is where I'll begin to disagree. I think designing things to run intermittently is anti-progress, and I don't think capital allocators will project finance anything like that. They're always driving for higher resource utilization. You want to, if you're going to invest the capital into a facility, you want to get as much out of it as possible. And so you want to be running them 24/7 no matter what. Yes, there are these edge cases where if it's already built and already paid off, sure, maybe there's some reason that you don't need to run it. But remember, we want to move towards a world where we have 10 times as many factories, 10 times as much stuff being produced. So that pretty much means everything in the future that we want is going to be brand new, 40 or 50 years from now also. So I would push back on intermittency being a desirable outcome. And then when you want to layer in storage, it just makes the material consumption of your entire system that much more. That's what it always comes back to for me. It's like, what is the mass of the entire system that you have engineered to deliver a unit of energy? You want that to be as low as possible.
Do you want to respond?
Yeah, I mean, I may be misunderstood here. Wouldn't be the first time. But I guess when I'm saying like there's an opportunity here to like perform some like industrial jiu-jitsu, what I'm talking about is like the production of like relatively low cost, very generic commodity resources. So to take for one example, methane, which we're producing, methanol. So the part of the layer, or like the layer of this process that's intermittent, is just the first like value generation layer, right? And you can run the math. Anyone can run the math. Pull out a spreadsheet, and we've got various blog posts that'll walk you through this. It turns out that if you want to make methane or methanol as cheaply as possible, it just pays to run it intermittently. It's just far cheaper to do it with intermittent solar than it is with any other power source, even with battery backup. We've run every possible trade under the sun, and this is very clear. But once you've generated that commodity, and it could be cement, it could be fresh water, it could be heat for like seasonal energy storage, it could be methane, methanol, and other chemicals. Then those products have like much higher value density. It's trivial to store them for like days, weeks, months, years, depending on your preference. And then everything that's downstream of that, as I said at the beginning, is like you don't have to replace it. You don't have to go and rebuild that entire capital stack. And you can run that 24 hours a day if you want. Or you can idle factories and so on. It's certainly true that some assets you want to run 24 hours a day if you can. Others we don't care about so much. So like cell phone is technically a supercomputer in your pocket, that the actual amount of like computing hours that will be put onto your CPU and your cell phone over the course of that phone's lifetime is like measured in a small number of seconds, right? This seems crazy, but like in order to save power, your cell phone goes to sleep between you punching out buttons when you're texting your friend, because you are a slow creature compared to it. Okay. Yeah. And then after a couple of years, you're like, well, I've gotten well over $1,000 value out of this pocket supercomputer. I'll just toss it in the trash and buy another one. But like the utilization of a cell phone's, like magical thinking silicon is hilariously low, but it still makes sense economically. Just as one example.
Bret, doesn't nuclear sort of have the opposite problem in that? So I've heard two reasons for why nuclear has to run 24/7. Right. So one is it can't do load following. It can't, ramp up and down quickly. And then the other is, well, because it costs so much to build a plant, you can't afford not to run it all the time. Right. So we can only provide baseload power, and therefore it can't, provide like all of our power.
So the first part of that, it's not true from either a physics perspective or from a regulatory perspective in some regulatory context. So you can load follow. It's a matter of ramp rate for most PWRs, pressurized water reactors, the ones that are the most common. They are physically capable of doing that over, let's say, a few percent an hour or something like that. And then you could make it ramp or load follow or divert load from from one process to another much faster with some minor design tweaks too. There's nothing fundamental about the technology.
Sorry, dumb question. Is a few percent an hour, is that good enough to sort of do load following for a normal, city, metro area consumption? Like how fast do you need to?
Well, I think it all depends on over what zone you're supplying your load to and how that levels out the curve. There's not one answer to that.
I mean, a normal power plant would provide power to a city or some part of a city, right? So if you have one metro area, I mean, when you say a few percent an hour, I just don't. Is that fast? Is that slow? I don't know how that compares to the load changes that you need to follow.
Well, if you look at load changes over a seasonal basis, that would surely cover it. And then on a daily basis, you'd probably track your load profile somewhat, but not quite be able to match it exactly.
Okay.
But that's with the existing technology, the way that it's configured today. It's just you're just not allowed to operate a nuclear power plant like that. And then on the second point, I think the second point actually is the argument that I'm making, is that when you invest money into physical infrastructure, you want as high utilization as possible to make the economics for the people who put money into that as good as possible. And so that's my challenge with the concept of running factories intermittently. The people who write the check for that are not going to see that as advantageous as running it full bore 24/7.
So recently we've heard all these companies are doing all these tech companies are doing nuclear deals, or they're announcing nuclear investments or deals for their data centers, presumably for AI. Why are they all going nuclear? Why aren't they doing solar plus batteries?
Well, that has been the position. The 24/7 clean energy mandates for Google excluded nuclear initially, and some of the others did too, and then eventually they came around. Amazon, did like a half deal with nuclear that kind of set up the stage for Microsoft to do a big deal with nuclear. And then I think just for, this is how big tech companies and the public markets work. Once there's this consensus that something, might make your stock price pop a little bit, you all have to do it. And so I think then Google became a late follower, just because there was enough buy-in from society that it would actually positively affect how the company was perceived.
What do you think about these deals? I assume you've read the announcements. Do these seem real? Are they going to happen soon? I mean, they're doing stuff in the U.S. where you decided it was difficult to do things, and many others have decided. So,
yeah. I mean, what most people don't realize about me is I'm simultaneously the biggest advocate of nuclear, but also one of the biggest critics of the nuclear industry. And so I do think that a lot of the approaches that they have chosen, obviously this is a self-serving comment because it's not my technology, they're going to be tough paths. I mean, you see in the announcements, they're announcing these for delivery in the mid-2030s. I mean, that's longer than some of these tech companies have been around. So, I think they're going to struggle with their current approach. But listen, the tailwinds are great for us regardless. And if this is just kind of like the opening salvo for them to then educate themselves on all of the various nuclear options, and then finally find their way to the ones that are the most concrete and the most near term, I think it's undoubtedly a good thing.
What about every other energy technology that we haven't talked about? So there's geothermal, there's wind, there's fossil fuels, there's fusion. Some people have even thought that maybe fusion will obsolete fission before fission can be made economical. So so what about all the other energy sources? Will they have a role to play, and what might that be?
Yeah, well, this is where I get to make everyone mad.
Finally.
Yeah, okay. I'll leave one or two for you.
Leave fusion for me.
Okay. If you insist. The short answer to this question is look at the scoreboard. Some of these technologies are not hypothetical. Some of them are being deployed at vast scale right now with business models that make a shitload of money for all the people involved, and the economic feedback loop that's kind of driving ongoing accelerating deployment and ongoing accelerating cost reduction is already in place. And for the others, it is a hypothetical that depends on a number of facts about the universe that are not currently known and that are hard to discover, turning out to be in our favor. Which is someone who's worked first in physics and then in hardware space for most of my career, is something that I'm extremely paranoid about ever being true. It's like the closest follow-on to solar would be wind, which has also followed similar cost curves. But it's also quite apparent that when people talk about economies of scale, there's multiple different economies of scale. And the economies of scale that, for example, nuclear found in the late 60s and 70s was we'll build a giant plant to amortize some of these fixed costs over much larger production. Whereas the economies of scale for microchips is we'll just make trillions of them. That's a different kind of scale. Or container ships is you make a big container ship. You don't make trillions of small container ships to find scale. And so the way that solar and wind respectively found economies of scale turned out to work much better for solar than for wind. And I think it's if I was in the wind industry right now, I'd be thinking real hard, like, how the hell am I going to get to $10 a megawatt hour? Because for solar, I think it's a foregone conclusion that we'll get there sooner or later. But for wind, I think, it's really quite difficult. And for anyone else, I mean, $10 a megawatt hour is kind of the, in my mind, that's that's the point where you can start having conversation. Like, how do you get to that sort of cost?
Can I do a takedown of fusion now?
Yeah, sure.
So I've looked real hard at this. I was actually an ARPA-E grant reviewer for 2 of their fusion programs as well. And I really struggle to see a single advantage that fusion has over fission. And I think it all starts with the problem of, well, I mean, first, let me just state outright, I don't think radiation is as big an issue as it is in people's head. It's a hazard like any other, but not a disproportionate hazard. But what most people believe about fusion is that it is the lower radioactivity version of nuclear power, and that is fundamentally not true. It is 7 times higher from a radioactivity perspective when measured on a per unit energy delivered basis. And that's the problem. We don't have fusion right now at commercial scales. And so everyone is able to just project their fantasies on what it'll become and not the reality. I'll let the fusion people believe whatever they want to believe about the technology itself. I will give it to them. Your reactor works exactly like you say it'll work. But when it works, it will not be desirable to society, and it will not have any cost or performance advantages over fission.
Wow. Okay.
I have one more thing to say about fusion as well. Just going to stick the boot in here. Step 1, you have to make the damn thing work, right? No one has done that yet. Step 2, you have to make it cheap enough that you can make money. No one has done that yet either. And step 3, you then have to make hundreds of thousands of them, right? Manufacturing is like hard mode. like there's a reason that Elon got like that. Okay, just to be really blunt. Okay, and then you have to execute all these things flawlessly. And by the way, you're not competing against solar cost today. You're competing against solar cost whenever you finish this impossible chain of things to do. And I wish them well, because like one of my lifelong passions is building cities on Mars as well. And like nuclear power is probably great there if we can figure out how to do it cheaply enough. But I wouldn't want to run that race personally. It's a really tough one.
Okay, so the future is going to be some combination of solar and fission based on which one of you races faster and gets there first. I like that. Thank you very much to our panelists. Thank you to the audience.